I didn't say a word when they congratulated themselves for building an entire neighborhood on my land. I just stood there, breathing in the sharp bite of fresh asphalt and wet concrete, and let them finish every last house. The air still carried that chemical tang the day I drove back down County Road 214, the same road my grandfather paved with his own money back in 1968, except now it had a different name on the sign, something polished and fake like Whitmore Estates Drive, bolted into the ground like history could be replaced with a logo. My tires crunched over gravel that didn't belong there, and I could hear the distant hum of HVAC units kicking on in homes that shouldn't exist, a low mechanical chorus echoing across land I hadn't sold, hadn't leased, hadn't even negotiated. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and that land, every inch of those rolling 62 acres just outside Austin, had been in my family for 3 generations, passed down with more than just a deed, passed down with rights most people wouldn't understand unless they knew exactly where to look. When I stepped out of my truck, the heat hit me first, that thick Texas heat pressing against my skin, carrying with it the smell of freshly cut sod and new lumber, and underneath it all, something else, something wrong, like walking into your own house and realizing someone moved the walls. There were kids riding bikes down a street that used to be my access road, their laughter bouncing off vinyl siding and decorative stone facades. And for a second, just a second, it almost looked normal, like this neighborhood had always been here, like my grandfather's cattle hadn't grazed this exact stretch of land for 40 years, like the old drainage ditch running along the South Ridge hadn't quietly controlled every drop of runoff through this entire valley. That's when I saw her, Margaret Whitmore, standing near a white BMW, clipboard in hand, smiling that polished, rehearsed smile she used in zoning meetings and HOA elections, the kind of smile that says everything is under control because she decided it was. She spotted me before I could say a word, heels clicking against the pavement as she walked over like she owned the ground between us, which, according to her paperwork, she probably thought she did. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, voice smooth, almost sweet, like we were meeting at a charity event instead of on stolen land. "You should have come by sooner. We've made a lot of improvements." Improvements. I glanced past her shoulder at the rows of identical houses stretching out across what used to be open pasture, each one connected by infrastructure that tied into systems older than any of those foundations, systems that didn't show up on her permits or her site plans. Water lines, drainage channels, access easements, things my grandfather had put in place long before anyone thought about building subdivisions out here. "You didn't return any notices," she added, tilting her head slightly, that smile tightening just enough to reveal the edge beneath it. At some point, unused land becomes opportunity. I could hear the faint hiss of irrigation systems kicking on somewhere behind her, sprinklers ticking in perfect rhythm, fed by a source she hadn't even questioned, because why would she? People like Margaret don't look for what's buried. They look at what's visible, what's profitable, what they can stamp their name on. I nodded once, slow, steady, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make her wonder if I was about to argue, about to threaten, about to do something loud and predictable. But I didn't. I just looked past her, past the houses, past the neat little sidewalks and manicured lawns, and pictured the original survey lines, the ones recorded in ink older than the city permits she waved around like shields. She followed my gaze, misreading it completely. "It's a beautiful community," she said, almost proudly now. 196 homes. Fully approved. Fully compliant. 196. She said it like a victory, like a number that proved something. I let out a slow breath, tasting dust and concrete on the back of my tongue, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt something settle into place, not anger, not panic, something colder, something patient. Because what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that every single one of those 196 homes depended on something they never bothered to check, something that didn't belong to their HOA, their developers, or their city permits. It belonged to me, and I was going to let them keep building, keep selling, keep believing they had won, right up until the moment I chose to show them exactly what I owned. I did not argue with her, and that was the part that bothered Margaret the most. You could see it in the way her smile lingered just a second too long, like she was waiting for me to snap, to threaten lawsuits, to do something loud enough for her to shut down with another piece of paper. But I had learned a long time ago that the loudest person in the room usually loses the moment the paperwork shows up, and Margaret Whitmore was very loud. I got back in my truck, the leather seat still hot from the sun, and drove the full length of what used to be my property, slowly, deliberately, taking it all in like I was walking through someone else's memory of my life. Every turn, every streetlight, every mailbox placed exactly where my grandfather's survey stakes used to stand. I could hear the low hum of transformers mounted on poles that had been installed without a single call to the original utility easement holder, which was interesting, because that easement was not registered to the county or the city or any developer that had ever touched this land. It was registered to my family. I stopped near the south end of the development where the land dipped just slightly, almost unnoticeable unless you knew what to look for, and I stepped out again, boots sinking into soft soil that had been recently graded. Beneath that soil ran the old drainage channel, the one my grandfather had engineered after a flood back in 1974, a system designed to redirect stormwater across the entire valley and protect everything downstream, including what was now 196 brand new homes. The faint trickle of water moved under the surface, quiet, controlled, doing exactly what it had done for decades without anyone ever thinking about it. I crouched down and pressed my hand against the ground, feeling the coolness beneath the heat, and I could not help but smile just a little, because that system was not part of any HOA documentation. It was not listed in any of their glossy brochures or sales pitches, and yet it was the reason this entire development could exist without turning into a muddy disaster after the first heavy rain. By the time I got back to my truck, a white SUV had pulled up behind me, security, or at least someone pretending to be, a young guy in a polo shirt with a badge clipped to his belt like that made him official. "Sir, this is private property," he said, trying to sound confident, but his eyes flicked to my truck, to the dust, to the way I stood like I had been here longer than any of this. I nodded once. "I know," I said, and that was it, because technically, he was not wrong, just not in the way he thought. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of documents spread out under a single overhead light, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence while I traced lines on old maps with my finger. Deeds from 1962. Amendments from 1974. A water rights filing from 1928 that most people would have overlooked because it was written in language nobody uses anymore. My grandfather had not just owned land. He had secured control over how that land functioned, how water moved across it, how access was granted and restricted, and those rights did not expire just because someone filed a new zoning application. I could still hear Margaret's voice in my head, smooth and certain, talking about opportunity, about improvements, about compliance, and I wondered if she had ever actually read the fine print on the land she claimed to control, or if she had just trusted that her connections and her permits were enough. I picked up one document in particular, a thin sheet of paper that did not look like much until you understood what it meant, and I set it aside carefully, separate from the rest. That was the one that mattered. Not the land itself, not the houses, not even the road they renamed, but the underlying system that every single one of those things depended on. Outside, the wind picked up just enough to carry the distant sound of neighborhood life, garage doors opening, dogs barking, someone laughing across a backyard that used to belong to my family, and I leaned back in my chair, completely still, letting that sound settle into the quiet of my house. They were living on it now, building their routines, their assumptions, their sense of ownership, and I was going to let them. Because the longer they believed it was theirs, the harder it would hit when they realized it never was. I did not call a lawyer the next morning, and I did not file anything with the county either, which is exactly what Margaret expected me to do, because people like her build their entire strategy around reacting faster than everyone else, flooding you with paperwork until you drown in deadlines and fees. Instead, I drove back out there again, earlier this time, just as the sun was coming up, when the neighborhood was quiet enough to hear the details most people ignore. The soft click of irrigation timers. The distant rush of water moving through pipes. The faint buzz of streetlights shutting off one by one as daylight took over. I parked near the main entrance, right under that polished stone sign with her name carved into it, and I watched as a line of cars started pulling out for the morning commute, tires rolling over a road that had not existed a few months ago, but somehow connected perfectly to the county highway without a single permit filed under the original access agreement. That was the first thing I confirmed. They had tied into my access easement. Not the county's. Mine. It was subtle, buried in how the road curved and where it met the original gravel base my grandfather had laid decades ago. But once you saw it, you could not unsee it. I stepped out and walked the edge of the pavement, dragging my boot lightly along the seam where new asphalt met old foundation, feeling the slight difference in texture, like a scar someone tried to smooth over without understanding what was underneath. A man jogging by slowed down, earbuds in, giving me that polite suburban nod, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet existed because of a document signed 60 years before he was born. That was the thing about all of this. None of them knew. They had bought houses, signed mortgages, trusted glossy brochures and confident sales pitches, never once asking who actually controlled the systems that made their neighborhood function. I spent the rest of that morning mapping it out in my head, piece by piece, walking the perimeter, tracing lines that no longer showed up on modern plats but still existed in the original filings. The water line feeding the entire subdivision cut across the North Ridge, tied directly into a source that had been registered under my family name long before the city expanded this far. The drainage system ran beneath the lowest section of the development, quietly managing runoff that would otherwise flood half the properties during a heavy storm. And the road, the one they were so proud of, the one with the new name and the decorative lighting, sat directly on top of an easement that had never been transferred, never been sold, never even been mentioned in any of the documents Margaret had waved in my face. By noon, the neighborhood was fully awake, lawn mowers humming, garage doors opening, delivery trucks weaving through streets that should not legally exist, and I stood there for a moment longer, just watching it all operate like a perfectly designed machine built on a foundation nobody had bothered to check. That afternoon, I made one phone call, not to a lawyer, not yet, but to the county records office, a quiet conversation confirming what I already knew, that none of the core underlying rights tied to this land had been reassigned, not officially, not legally, not in any way that would hold up when it actually mattered. The woman on the other end of the line sounded almost bored as she read off the entries, just another file in a system full of them. But to me, every word locked something into place. I thanked her, hung up, and sat there in the silence of my truck, engine off, heat building slowly inside the cab, thinking about Margaret, about her confidence, about the way she had stood there and told me this was opportunity. She thought she had taken something from me. In reality, she had built something for me, something much bigger than a piece of land, something that multiplied in value every time another family moved in and another system connected to the ones she did not control. I turned the key, the engine rumbling back to life, and pulled away without looking back, because there was nothing left to confirm. Everything I needed was already in motion, and the best part was, they were the ones who had set it all up for me. I let a week pass before I stepped into her world, not mine, not the land, but her version of control, the polished office tucked between a boutique gym and a coffee shop that smelled like roasted beans and ambition, where everything looked curated down to the last framed certificate on the wall. The air inside was cool, conditioned, carrying that faint scent of citrus cleaner and expensive perfume, the kind of place designed to make people feel small the moment they walked in. Margaret Whitmore sat behind a glass desk, sunlight catching the edges like it was part of the presentation, and when she looked up and saw me, that same practiced smile returned, only this time there was something sharper behind it, like she had been waiting for this moment and was already 3 steps ahead in her own mind. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, folding her hands neatly, posture perfect. I was wondering how long it would take. I did not sit right away, just stood there for a second, letting the silence stretch, listening to the faint hum of the air conditioning vent above us and the distant click of someone typing in the next room. "You built a lot out there," I said, keeping my voice level, almost casual, like we were discussing whether instead of 196 houses sitting on land she had no right to claim. She smiled wider at that, like she was being complimented. "We created a community," she corrected, emphasizing the word like it meant something official, something untouchable. "Fully permitted, fully approved, every document signed and filed." She reached for a folder on her desk and slid it toward me without opening it, just enough for me to see the thickness of it, the weight of paper she believed protected her. "You had your chance to contest," she added, her tone shifting just slightly, less sweet now. More instructive. There were notices. Public filings. You chose not to respond. I finally sat down, the chair soft but structured, designed for meetings that ended in agreement, and I nodded once. That is true, I said. I did not respond. She leaned back, satisfied, like that admission was the end of the conversation, like everything that mattered had already been decided in her favor weeks ago. Then I am not sure what you expect to accomplish now, she said, tilting her head just a fraction, studying me the way someone studies a problem they already solved. I could hear the faint tick of a wall clock behind her, steady, measured, counting seconds that did not belong to her as much as she thought they did. I came to understand your position, I replied, and that made her pause, just for a moment, because it was not the answer she expected. People usually came in angry or desperate. They did not come in calm. My position, she repeated, almost amused. My position is simple. The land was unused. We improved it. The law supports development when property is neglected. That is not personal, Mr. Caldwell. That is progress. Progress. I let that word sit in the air between us, heavy, misplaced, like it did not quite belong in the conversation, but she needed it to. I glanced briefly at the window behind her, where the reflection of her office overlapped with the street outside, a perfect blend of control and illusion. And everything out there functions the way you planned? I asked, keeping my tone neutral, almost curious. She did not hesitate. Of course it does, she said. We have utilities, drainage, access, everything designed to modern standards. That was when I saw it, not in her words, but in the confidence behind them, the absolute certainty that nothing had been overlooked. Good, I said quietly, nodding again, and this time I leaned forward just slightly, resting my hands on the edge of her desk, feeling the cool glass under my fingertips. That is important. Her eyes narrowed just a fraction, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to catch the shift, the first crack in that perfect composure. Important for what? She asked. I straightened up, pushing the chair back just enough to stand, not rushing, not dramatic, just deliberate. For what comes next, I said, and I could feel the weight of that sentence settle into the room, heavier than any stack of documents she had on that desk. She opened her mouth like she was about to respond, to regain control of the conversation, to pull it back into the structure she understood, but I was already turning toward the door, the faint scent of citrus trailing behind me as I stepped back into the hallway. I did not need to argue with her. I did not need to prove anything in that office. She believed she owned the outcome because she controlled the process, but she had built her entire strategy on what was visible, on what could be filed and stamped and presented in neat folders. She had never asked the only question that mattered, not what she owned, but what everything she built depended on. I did not contact a lawyer right away, and that was intentional, because lawyers react to problems, but I was not reacting anymore. I was positioning, and there is a difference most people never learn until it is too late. Instead, I spent the next few days doing something far less dramatic and far more effective. I watched. I drove through that neighborhood at different hours. Early mornings when the sprinklers clicked on in perfect sequence, mid-afternoons when delivery trucks rolled through without hesitation, evenings when porch lights flickered on one by one like a system breathing on its own, and every single time, I paid attention to the same three things: water, access, and flow. The sound of water moving through pipes was the first constant, a low, steady pressure you could feel if you knew how to listen, because water does not lie. It follows the path it is given, and in this case, that path still belonged to me. I parked near one of the hydrants one afternoon, watching a maintenance worker test the valve, a quick twist, a burst of pressure, then back to normal, routine, controlled, completely dependent on a source that had never been transferred out of my family's name. He did not know it, of course. To him it was just infrastructure, something that had always been there, something that would always be there, because that is how people think when systems work. They stop questioning who actually owns them. The second thing was access, and that one was almost easier to see, because every car, every delivery, every visitor used the same entrance point where that polished sign stood, the one Margaret was so proud of, but beneath that sign was a base layer that tied directly into the original easement my grandfather secured, a legal corridor that allowed passage across the land under very specific conditions. Conditions that had never been updated, never been reassigned, and definitely never been granted to a private homeowners association building nearly 200 homes on top of it. I walked that entrance more than once, running my hand along the edge of the stone, feeling the heat trapped in it from the Texas sun, and I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in the back of my head, reminding me that land is not just dirt, it is structure, it is rights, it is control over how things move through it. The third thing was flow, not just water, not just cars, but everything, electricity, waste, drainage, all of it designed to move in a way that made life inside that neighborhood feel seamless, effortless, like it had always been there. And that was the biggest mistake they made. They built something that depended on continuity without ever securing the foundation that guaranteed it. By the end of the week, I had everything I needed, not in a file, not in a single document, but in a complete picture of how their entire development functioned, and more importantly, how it could stop functioning without ever touching a single house. That was when I finally made the call. Not to argue, not to complain, but to begin the process. The lawyer I chose was not the loud type, not the kind that advertises on billboards or promises quick wins. He was quiet, methodical, the kind of man who understood that the strongest cases are built long before they are ever presented. I sat across from him in a small office that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, sliding a single document across his desk, the same one I had set aside days earlier, and I watched his expression change as he read it, slowly at first, then more carefully, like he was realizing the scope of what he was looking at. "They built all of this on top of this?" he asked, glancing up at me, not confused, just impressed in a way that did not need words. I nodded once. "Every bit of it depends on it," I said. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a quiet breath, the kind that comes when a case shifts from difficult to inevitable. "Then you did the right thing," he said. "You let them finish." I did not smile, but I felt it, that same cold, steady certainty settling in again, because this was never about stopping them. It was about letting them build something they could not walk away from, something that tied them, legally and functionally, to a system they did not control. I stood up, leaving the document with him, knowing that from this point forward, everything would move through the proper channels, filings, notices, proceedings, all of it structured, all of it deliberate, and none of it rushed. As I stepped back outside, the late afternoon heat hit me again, heavy, familiar, carrying the distant sound of that neighborhood continuing its routine without a single sign of what was coming. And that was exactly how it needed to be, because the strongest move is the one nobody sees until it is already in effect. I filed the case on a Tuesday morning, not because Tuesday mattered, but because timing does, and I wanted everything to begin when the week was fully in motion, when people were at work, when routines were established, when the system they trusted was already running without interruption. The courthouse smelled like old paper and polished wood, that familiar quiet hum of ceiling vents and distant footsteps echoing through hallways that had seen every kind of dispute imaginable. But this one felt different, at least to me, because I was not there to argue what happened. I was there to establish what had always been true. My lawyer handled the filings with the same calm precision I had seen in his office, each document placed, each reference cited, each clause connected back to something older, something stronger than anything Margaret Whitmore had built her confidence on. We did not rush it. We did not flood the court with unnecessary noise. We presented exactly what mattered, nothing more, nothing less. By the time we stepped back outside, the sun was already high, the air thick with heat rising off the pavement, and I could hear the city moving around us. Cars passing, people talking, life continuing like nothing had changed, which was the point, because the real shift does not happen when papers are filed. It happens when those papers start moving through the system. It took 3 days for the first notice to reach them. I was not there when it happened, but I could picture it clearly. Margaret in her office, that same glass desk, that same controlled environment, opening an envelope that did not fit into her expectations. At first, she probably treated it like any other challenge, another complaint, another attempt to slow her down, something to be handled, dismissed, or redirected. But this was different, and I knew the exact moment she would realize it. The moment she would reach the part of the filing that did not argue ownership of the houses, did not contest the construction, did not demand demolition or damages. Instead, it defined something far more precise. Dependency. That word changes everything when it is backed by documentation. I drove past the neighborhood that evening, just as the sky shifted into that deep orange glow that makes everything look calm, almost peaceful, and I could see people outside, watering lawns, walking dogs, talking across driveways like they had always lived there, like this place had always been theirs. The streetlights flickered on one by one, casting that soft, even light across sidewalks and parked cars, and for a moment, nothing looked different. But I knew what was already in motion beneath the surface. Notices being reviewed, responses being drafted, conversations starting to shift in tone as legal teams began to understand what they were actually dealing with. 2 days later, I got the call. My lawyer's voice was steady, almost quiet, but there was a weight behind it now, the kind that only shows up when the other side starts asking the right questions too late. They requested clarification, he said. I leaned back in my chair, the faint creak of wood under me, and looked out the window at my own land, the part that had not been touched, the part that still sat exactly as it always had. On what? I asked, already knowing the answer. There was a brief pause on the line, just long enough to confirm it. On whether the infrastructure described in the filing is fully controlled under your existing rights, he said. I closed my eyes for a second, not out of stress, not out of relief, just to let the moment settle into something real, something solid. And I asked. He did not hesitate. We confirmed it, he said. That was it. No raised voices. No dramatic reaction. Just confirmation. I thanked him, ended the call, and sat there in the quiet, listening to the faint sound of wind moving through the trees outside, the same wind that had moved across this land long before anyone thought about building on it. Somewhere out there, Margaret Whitmore was reading documents she did not fully understand, realizing that this was not a dispute she could manage with confidence and connections, that this was something embedded deeper than permits and approvals. I stood up, stepping outside into the late evening air, the temperature finally dropping just enough to feel the shift, and I looked out toward the direction of that neighborhood, still running, still functioning, still unaware. They had built something impressive, something complete, something that worked perfectly, and now, for the first time, they were beginning to understand that none of it actually belonged to them in the way they thought it did. The shift did not happen all at once. It never does. It started quietly, almost politely, like something adjusting behind the scenes before anyone notices the change, and I could feel it in the tone of the next letter they sent, the language tighter, more careful, less confident than before. I was sitting on my back porch when it arrived, the late afternoon sun stretching shadows across the yard, the faint smell of dry grass and warm wood in the air, and I opened it slowly, not because I needed to, but because I understood that this was the moment where their certainty had started to crack. They were no longer dismissing the claim. They were asking questions, specific ones, the kind that only come up when someone realizes they are missing something important. They wanted clarification on scope, on boundaries, on whether the systems referenced in the filing could be separated from their development without disruption. I read that line twice, the word disruption sitting there like a quiet admission, because that was the first time they acknowledged what I had known from the beginning, that everything they built was connected in ways they could not easily undo. I folded the letter carefully and set it on the table beside me, listening to the distant sound of wind moving through the trees, steady, unchanged, and for a moment, I just let the silence settle, because there was no urgency left in any of this, not for me. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. More communication, more requests, more careful wording, and each one told the same story, without ever saying it directly. They were trying to understand how deep the dependency went, and every answer they uncovered led them further into a position they could not reverse. I drove past the neighborhood again that week, just like before, but this time there was a difference you could not see unless you were looking for it. The routine was still there, the same morning commutes, the same evening lights, the same quiet hum of systems running smoothly, but underneath it, there was hesitation, small things, subtle things, a maintenance crew lingering longer than necessary near a water access point, a utility truck parked at the entrance with 2 men studying something on a tablet, their posture tense in a way that did not match routine work. They were checking, verifying, tracing lines they should have traced before they ever poured a single foundation. I slowed my truck as I passed the main entrance, the polished sign still standing there like a statement, but now it looked different. not because anything had changed physically, but because I knew what they were starting to realize. That everything beyond that sign was tied to something they did not own. Later that afternoon, my lawyer called again, his voice carrying that same steady tone, but now there was a layer of finality beneath it. "They are requesting a meeting," he said. I leaned back in my chair, the faint creak of wood grounding the moment, and looked out across my land, the part that remained untouched, the part that had never needed to prove anything. "Not in court," he added. "They want to discuss resolution." I let that sit for a second, not reacting, just processing the shift for what it was, not a negotiation, not yet, but the first step toward it. "And what did you tell them?" I asked. He paused briefly, just enough to let the weight of his answer land properly. "I told them we would proceed as scheduled," he said. That was the right answer. Because this was never about meeting halfway. It was about establishing reality, and reality does not adjust itself to convenience. I ended the call and stepped outside, the evening air cooler now, carrying that quiet stillness that comes just before night settles in, and I looked out in the direction of that neighborhood again, imagining the conversations happening behind closed doors, the shift in tone, the realization spreading from one person to another, from legal teams to board members, from Margaret Whitmore down through every layer of the structure she believed she controlled. She had built something impressive, something complete, something that functioned exactly the way she intended, and now she was beginning to understand the one detail she had overlooked, the one detail that mattered more than all of it combined. She did not control what made it work. And once that truth settles in, everything else starts to change, slowly at first, then all at once. The courtroom did not feel dramatic when I walked in, and that was exactly why it mattered, because real power does not need spectacle, it just needs the right place at the right time with the right documents. The air was cool, steady, carrying that faint scent of paper and polished wood, and the quiet murmur of voices filled the room as people settled into their seats, each one believing they understood what this case was about. Margaret Whitmore sat across the aisle, posture perfect, dressed like she was attending a business presentation instead of a legal proceeding, her expression controlled, but not as effortless as it had been before. There was a tightness now, a precision to the way she held herself, like she was managing something just beneath the surface. Her legal team surrounded her, folders open, papers organized, every page prepared to defend what they believed they owned. I took my seat beside my lawyer, the chair firm beneath me, grounding, familiar, and I let my hands rest calmly on the table, feeling the smooth surface under my fingertips as the room settled into silence. When the judge entered, everything shifted into that formal stillness, the kind that strips away confidence and replaces it with structure, rules, and facts that do not bend for anyone. The proceedings began the way they always do, measured, deliberate, each side given the opportunity to present their position, and Margaret's team went first, outlining permits, approvals, development plans, all the visible things, all the things that made their case look complete. They spoke about investment, about community, about compliance, their voices steady, practiced, built on the assumption that complexity would favor them, that volume would create authority. I listened without interruption, without reaction, because none of it mattered, not in the way they thought it did. When it was our turn, my lawyer did not raise his voice, did not rush. He simply stood, adjusted a single document on the table, and began with a sentence that shifted the entire room without anyone realizing it at first. He did not challenge the houses. He did not dispute the construction. He defined the system. The words were precise, controlled, each one placed exactly where it needed to be, establishing not what had been built, but what everything depended on. I could see it happen in real time, the subtle change in posture from Margaret's side, the slight hesitation as they realized the argument was not where they expected it to be. My lawyer introduced the first document, then the second, each one older than anything they had filed, each one tied to rights that had never been transferred, never been overridden, never been acknowledged in any of their plans. Water, access, drainage, the foundation of everything they had built. Margaret leaned forward at that point, her composure tightening, eyes scanning the documents as they were presented, and for the first time since I had met her, she did not look certain. She looked focused in a different way, like she was trying to solve something that no longer fit within the rules she thought she understood. The judge asked a question, simple, direct, about control, about whether the systems described could operate independently of the rights outlined in those documents. And that was the moment everything narrowed down to a single point. My lawyer did not hesitate. They cannot, he said. No explanation. No elaboration. Just fact. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was quiet, heavy, the kind that settles in when something becomes unavoidable. Margaret's legal team shifted, papers moving, whispers exchanged, but there was no immediate response that could undo what had just been established. Because this was not about interpretation. It was about existence. Those systems either belonged to them or they did not. And they did not. I sat there, still, listening to the faint hum of the room, the distant shuffle of papers, the measured breathing of people realizing the shape of the situation had changed, and I thought back to that first day, the smell of asphalt, the sound of construction, the certainty in Margaret's voice when she told me they had improved the land. She had been right about one thing. They had built something impressive, something complete, something that worked perfectly. The only problem was, they had built it on top of something they never bothered to understand. And now, in a room where assumptions did not matter, where confidence did not carry weight, that detail was the only thing that mattered. The decision did not come with raised voices or dramatic reactions. It came the way real decisions always do, steady, measured, written into record with a tone that does not need to explain itself twice. I sat there as the judge reviewed the final points, the documents laid out in front of him like a map that had already been drawn long before anyone in that room realized they were standing on it. Margaret Whitmore did not look at me when the conclusion started to take shape, her attention fixed on the papers in front of her, on the sections that no longer worked in her favor, on the details she had never thought to question when everything seemed so certain. The air in the courtroom felt different now, not tense, not chaotic, just settled, like something had finally aligned with the way it was always supposed to be. When the ruling was stated, it did not overturn the houses, it did not erase the neighborhood. It did something far more precise. It confirmed that every critical system supporting that entire development operated under rights that belonged to me, and without lawful access to those rights, the development could not function as intended. There was no need for anything more than that. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them carried through every layer of what Margaret had built. I could hear the faint shift of movement around the room, papers being gathered, chairs adjusting, people processing what that actually meant beyond the legal language. Margaret finally looked up then, not at the judge, but across the room, her expression no longer polished, no longer controlled in the way it had been when I first walked into her office. It was focused in a different way now, like she was seeing the full picture for the first time and realizing how much of it had never been hers. I did not speak. I did not need to. My lawyer leaned slightly toward me, his voice low, calm. "It is done," he said, and that was enough. Outside, the sunlight felt sharper, brighter, the heat rising off the pavement in waves as people stepped out of the courthouse and back into their routines. But nothing about this was routine anymore, not for them. I drove back toward the land that afternoon, the same road, the same turn, the same view opening up as I approached the entrance, but this time I did not slow down. I pulled in steady, deliberate, past the sign that still stood there like it meant something permanent. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had before, kids on bikes, cars in driveways, sprinklers ticking across lawns, everything operating the way it always had. But now there was something else layered over it, something invisible but absolute. Control, not over the houses, not over the people, but over the systems that made all of it possible. I parked near the edge of the main access point and stepped out, the gravel crunching lightly under my boots, the sound carrying just enough to remind me of what used to be here before any of this was built. A maintenance truck rolled past me slowly, the driver glancing in my direction, not recognizing me, not needing to, because this was never about recognition, it was about structure. Everything they relied on, every drop of water, every path in and out, every controlled flow beneath the surface, all of it traced back to something that had never changed hands. I stood there for a moment, looking out across the rows of houses stretching into the distance, identical, organized, complete, and I thought about how easily it could have gone differently if I had reacted the way they expected, if I had rushed, argued, tried to stop them before they finished what they started. But I did not. I let them build it. I let them invest in it. I let them believe it was theirs. Because ownership is not always about what you can see. It is about what everything else depends on. I turned back toward my truck, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement, and as I drove away, I did not feel the need to look back again. They would handle the next steps, negotiations, agreements, whatever it took to align their reality with what had just been established in that courtroom. And I would decide how that alignment happened. Not loudly, not emotionally, just the way it should be, on paper. Because in the end, they did not lose because I took something from them. They lost because they built everything on something that was never theirs to begin with.